sorry for the delay in getting going this afternoon, but thank you and for being here, and welcome to Student Thinking, Student Perspectives. This is a very important session for us at the National Council for Preservation Education. This session represents the sort of culmination, if you will, of a student paper competition. If you were at the National Trust meeting last year, is this kind of like echoing? Yeah. If you were at the National Trust meeting last year, you know that we, NTHP, sponsored a session where students gave papers. That was really a fine session, and a couple of those papers have just been published in our journal, HER. This year, I'd say we kind of ratcheted up the situation, because this year, NTHP, in conjunction with the National Trust, was able to offer the first ever scholarship associated with the student paper competition. And the winners of that scholarship are sitting before you and will be presenting papers. We ultimately got papers from throughout the United States, and these were, just to give you a tiny bit of background on the criteria. These had to be papers that were written during the last academic year by students who were enrolled in programs that are affiliated with the National Council. In one case, one of the students has subsequently graduated. She graduated in spring, but all the other speakers, I believe, will be finishing up more or less this year. Anyway, the process of administering the competition was handled very ably by Richard Wagner of Goucher College, who also conducted and administered the session last year, the papers that we received last year. The reviewers were Paul Kapp of the University of Illinois, Robert Melnick of the University of Oregon, and Noel Vernon of California State Polytechnic University, and also Rebecca Shepard of the University of Delaware. Just not to belabor what I'm saying, but I just want to briefly give you an idea of how we're going to structure the session. Each of the students will, former students will be, speakers will be presenting their papers, and there should be plenty of time after the four papers have been presented for question and answer period, which we hope will have a vigorous one. So without further delay, let me begin the introductions. So our first speaker this afternoon is Sarah White. Sarah is completing her master's project in historic preservation at the Boston Architectural College. Seems like it's echoing still. I don't know if that can be helped. She received her BA from Smith College and pursued her graduate studies at Michigan. Sarah has led preservation nonprofits and chaired several cultural and historic preservation-focused civic communities. She lives in Newburyport, Massachusetts.
Thank you, Lauren, and good afternoon. I'm going to apologize to my colleagues over here. You're going to get my back the entire time so I can see. Historic preservation, I think, has a lot of fascinating aspects to it. I mean, just look at the pictures of those houses up there on the screen. We've got Federal, we've got Good Revival, we've got a Mansard, and you can do paint analysis, just study of the architectural details. It's fascinating to me. But tonight, or this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about something that is absolutely the least fascinating part of historic preservation, the least sexy facet of our industry, and that's regulation and policy. But if it weren't for regulation and policy, a lot of us would not be able to do the work that we do because there would be far fewer historic assets available for us to work with. And I think specifically of local historic districts, or as we call them in Massachusetts, LHDs. I reside in Newburyport, and so many people I talk to from around the country think that we have preservation sewn up in Massachusetts. Well, we have problems, and we have a lot of work to do. This paper was a sort of preamble to my thesis, and when I spoke with my director, and I'm going to sort of quote you here, Bob, I'm sorry, but when I spoke with my director this past summer, I said, you know, I was involved in a local historic districting effort, and I just can't get it out of my mind. I've got to untangle it, and I think that's the only thing I can write my thesis on. And he looked at me and he said, well, of course, it makes total perfect sense. And besides, we always get to hear about the successes. We never get to hear about the failures like you had. But he meant that with complete love and kindness. And he's right. We don't spend enough time, at least in my circles, talking about where we fail and why we failed and what we can do to improve. What next steps do we have to take to bring preservation to the next level? So, before we start today's discussion, I want to sort of set the stage a little bit and take a look at the next page. So this is a pop quiz. These are two structures on the North Shore of Massachusetts. So what do you think the right answer to this is? What is the difference between these two properties, 1 and 2? The one on the right is a replica. Property number 1 is actually a Greek revival that was converted to a federal, which happens quite a bit where I live. And see, George Washington took a nap once in house number 2. Well, the answer is none of the above. That's what happened to house number 1. It was a federal built in 1807, and it was demolished in 2012. And it was demolished because it did not have regulatory protection. It was not in a local historic district. And the people who demolished the house wanted to put their pool there. So today I'd like to take a look at a few things. First, regulatory protection of historic assets. We've had regulatory protection in Massachusetts since 1960, and we call it Chapter 40C. It's the Historic Districts Act. And what it does is it allows communities to adopt 1 or more local historic districts. The law is 54 years old, and it was last modified ever so slightly in 1971. Now, in Massachusetts, historic districting law is completely separate from zoning law. We have 2 separate enabling statutes. We have 2 separate boards that will administer them at a local level. Chapter 40C is the only regulatory tool that we have in Massachusetts that can protect historic structures at scale. Some communities may have adopted a demolition delay ordinance, and what that does is that it prevents the demolition of a single structure for a limited amount of time, and they range in time from 90 days to a maximum of 18 months. So right now, Chapter 40C has been for 54 years a one-size-fits-all type of solution. If you get your district passed, excellent, but you don't get anything in return. There are no tax benefits, no credits, nothing. And while I like to think that doing something for the greater good is worth being involved in a district, we're finding more and more that that's not what the general public thinks. So, nice view of some Massachusetts structures. To date, after talking to the Massachusetts Historical Commission at length, and I've worked with them quite a bit over the years, they can confirm that historic districts are becoming harder and harder to pass. We say in Massachusetts we have over 220, and that over 220 means that we actually have a lot of single structure historic districts, and if we counted all those, we'd have over 400. We have about 2,300 in the United States, and Massachusetts has 220 of them. That's pretty good, but when you look at all the cities and towns in Massachusetts, and there are 351 of them, only 122 have local historic districts. Some have more than one. And how does that compare to the rest of New England? Well, we kind of fall somewhere in the middle. One of the things that Christopher Skelly, who's the Director of Local Government Programs at the Massachusetts Historical Commission, has tried to do is encourage people not to look for local historic district implementation anymore. It's so toxic of a subject that he's instead promoting neighborhood conservation districts. They're not overseen by state statute, they're done under local home rule, and they tend to be voluntary. And he's finding that he has more success than that, but when he was at a conference in New Hampshire, preservation conference, he talked about what he was promoting, conservation districts, and a whole group of preservationists got up and walked out of the room in protest because that wasn't good enough for them. That wasn't strong enough regulatory control. So then the question is, what do we do about that? What do we do to please the preservationists, but also please the general public and feel like everybody's getting something out of it? Now, according to the Massachusetts Historical Commission, all of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts all need further protection, including the ones that already have districts. What you see here in front of you is the number of local historic districts passed, the success-failure ratio of the passage of local historic districts by decade up until now, 2014. We just had one passed, a single district in, I believe it was Stowe, Massachusetts, and that single district passed, and the people sought out a single district only because it was too expensive for them to put a private preservation restriction on their property through Historic New England or a similar organization. So they sought state regulatory protection as a single district. But take a look at where we're going. I mean, that's a pretty sharp dive down to 2014. And now Massachusetts Historical Commission never kept track of this. So what I did was I went to the Mass Historical Commission and I looked through 54 years of files and took a look, community by community, at how many failed and why they failed. And I can tell you that why they failed is property rights, property rights, property rights. The biggest, most consistent complaint since the 1960s. And what I can also tell you is that in Newburyport, Massachusetts, where I chaired the local historic district study committee to try and implement a historic district, that's exactly what we ran across too. Irrespective of the amount of education we had performed throughout the course of over 5 years, once the property rights argument came into being, all bets were off. That stuck. And as you can see by the very active movement on both sides, say no to LHD, that movement underneath that federal image, it says support property owners' rights. Now, take a look at that house that's sitting there, that 18th century style house. Well, it is an 18th century house. And that was under a 1-year demolition delay order. And that's what the developer did throughout the period of that demolition delay. Left it open to the elements, built in the 1-year delay into his timeline, and down it came in January of 2012. But that was okay, according to the opposition, because it was his property and he could do with it whatever he wanted to. Perhaps, they said, we should just work harder at implementing our zoning laws and really enforce them, or a demolition delay. But one of the things that we found is that the general public has a fundamental misunderstanding of civics and how local law works, and could not understand that although we had zoning laws, they could not legally be applied to do what a historic district could do. Notice the bottom left, this text here. Throughout our country, in Massachusetts, right here in Newburyport, the rights of homeowners are under attack with increased momentum. And I point that out because the John Birch Society became involved in the Newburyport Historic District fight. Now, I thought they died when the Cold War did. The anti-communist, anti-red, save us all from the Red Brigade, they're still active, and this is part of what they get involved in. They're very concerned that communities who support local historic districts, who support the Green Communities Act and sustainability, this is all part of a UN plot to herd us all into cities for the purpose of social engineering. That was the rest of the memo that came out with that little blip there. So, you might want to herd me right out of the room because clearly I'm a dangerous person. And people believe this stuff. They really did. So, I think also one of the things that we saw was that the fight in Newburyport mirrored a lot of the vitriol that was occurring at the national level. The opposition twisted facts. They employed a lot of fiction, such that we were going to regulate paint color and we were going to make them maintain their homes on the schedule that we decided, and that, you know what, we were going to take over the interiors too. It was a complete takeover effort on our part. And they got nasty. Some members of our study committee were followed home at night after meetings. Emails were so bad and posts online that the local paper editor made everybody identify themselves after a while. I mean, this was local mudslinging at its best, but it is indicative of a problem that we have with regulatory measures. So what did we do? We lost our fight to establish a local historic district. We have a National Register district that's over 2,000 properties, and only 17 of them are protected with a district. So, after this fight, we found that a lot of pro-preservation individuals were elected to our city council, which is something that we really needed, but nobody was willing to take on an LHD again. So we came up with an interim solution that's a Band-Aid that desperately needs to be ripped off, but we're not ready to put a better bandage on it yet. So what we've done is, as you can see over here, this is our National Register district, over here on the left, the entire district. What we have overlaid is a zoning overlay done through local home rule, and it prevents the demolition of any structure that is on the National Register in that district, providing that the Historical Commission has done an advisory review and handing over the ultimate decision-making ability to the zoning board. It's unfortunate, but it's something. Now, on the right, this is an area within the National Register District that received federal funding during the Urban Renewal Program. And they received funding to restore rather than tear down what remained. We have a Newburyport Redevelopment Authority that had aesthetic oversight over that area, and that oversight dropped off many years ago. So instead, the zoning board is now looking at that as well. And as somebody said, it's something. So what do we do? If Chapter 40C isn't working, maybe it's time for regulatory reform. Instead of just giving people sticks, why not throw them a few carrots too? Because right now Chapter 40C has no carrots associated with it. So if we offer them a portfolio approach where they could pick and choose, mix and match the type of LHD that they want, well, why couldn't that work? And this is nothing, my ideas aren't set in stone, and I'd love to hear feedback on it, but why couldn't we give someone who agrees to be in an LHD, why couldn't they have energy conservation subsidies? Especially up north, our historic windows are the biggest complaint about energy loss. Even though they're wrong, that's what people think and believe. Why not give them some energy conservation subsidies? Or have a homeowner association style governing body whereby any fees collected will go towards any sort of restoration work that needs to be done within the community. These are possibilities and these are ideas. And if I'm going to present an idea, I feel that I have to put my money where my mouth is. So within the next couple of weeks, I'll be meeting with one of our state senators and some folks from the Massachusetts Historical Commission to just start laying the groundwork for change. Because change is necessary. If we as preservationists, who have made such huge strides over the last 50, 60, 70 years, are going to continue to be able to make great strides going forward. We want these properties available for generations to come. But unless we start paying closer attention, and this was a big lesson for us, unless we start paying closer attention to the needs and desires of the public, rightly or wrongly, there is a way, and there must be a way, to forge forward to create a new regulatory environment so that all of these properties will be available for future generations to enjoy. Thank you.